So we'll continue our series on some of the lesser-known prisoners and martyrs of the communist yoke in Romania. And today, as I said, we'll be talking about my favorite among them, and that's Father Ilie Lacatusu. And as I did with the first two, I'll give you just the facts of his life, and then at the end I'll tell you one of the more miraculous stories. I promise this week we're talking about someone who definitely had some miraculous occurrences in his life and after his life, and I think you'll see why I like him so much when we finish. So Father Ilie was born on December 6, 1908. He was the second child of 7 children to Marin and Maria Lacatusu, who were simple but very, very faithful peasants. His father was a chanter, and because of that, he would go to the church quite a bit, and he would take Ilie, the young Ilie, with him. And Ilie grew very close to the church because of that. He really fell in love with the church services. And so after graduating from school in his native village, Father Ilie decided that he wanted to become a priest. So he enrolled at St. Nicholas Theological Seminary from 1923, when he was the age of 14, until 1930. He excelled among his classmates, not as much in the academics, but more so in virtue and piety, something for which he was recognized officially at his graduation. They would give a particular award to the student who was recognized for his particular piety and humility. Between 1930 and 1934, he then studied at the Faculty of Theology in Bucharest, which was a very, very well-known place for theological studies. During this time, in 1931, he married a teacher, Ecaterina Popescu, with whom he had 5 children. In 1934, at the age of 25, he was ordained a priest, and he served a small parish in a small village of, I don't know how to pronounce it, Buicest, I think is the way it's pronounced. In 1942, so 8 years later, he was sent as a missionary to Transnistria in Moldova for 1 year before returning to his village. And then 10 years later in 1952, on July 19th, Father Ilie was arrested and he was imprisoned. And his arrest was a little bit unique. He had been involved with the Legionnaire movement. We talked about that last week, but not too heavily. But the reason his arrest and imprisonment was unique was because he was arrested and imprisoned, quote, by administrative decision, which meant that he was never officially tried in a court in court or convicted. It was simply an administrative decision of the communists that he was to be arrested and imprisoned, and so he was. He served 2 years in 2 different prisons during this time. He became very ill and very weak quite quickly. In the first location, he was imprisoned with numerous other priests, and these priests became known as the, quote, famous brigade of priests. They were often imprisoned together. In the second prison location, he was imprisoned with the very famous Valerio Gafencu, the so-called saint of the prisons. If you want to read about Valerio, you can read a book called The Saint of the Prisons, and you'll see that he was, of all the prisoners, he's probably the most beloved and respected. At a very young age, he had surpassed many of them spiritually. And whenever they were having a difficult time in the prisons with all the torments, they would go to Valerio, and he always had a comforting word. Father Valerio, by the way, his relics have not been found yet, but he, in the village where he was buried, the mayor did discover the body of who they thought might be Valerio, and Valerio apparently appeared to him in a dream and said, "That wasn't me, but when you dig again, you're going to find me. You'll find my relics." And they haven't, I don't know why they haven't dug yet, but they will look again, and apparently, based on his prophecy, he will be found. He was released 2 years later in 1954, Father Ilie was, and went to serve his small parish village parish, until 5 years later he was arrested again, and yet again it was by administrative decision. And he would spend the next 5 years in prison. After being sent, his physical torments also included great emotional trials, as he received news during this imprisonment that his 4th child had tragically died. During this period, he was sent to a torturous work camp in the Periprava colony, where many, many priests were imprisoned and put into forced labor. Here he met the very famous Father Jestin Parvu, who you can watch a lot of videos of him on YouTube. And at the end of this, I'll tell you a story from Father Jestin. In 1964, after 5 years of forced labor, he was released in seriously poor health. He was sent to a couple different villages, but he wasn't allowed to serve for many years initially after being released. And so he lived in utter poverty under house arrest and worked as a bricklayer. Eventually he was allowed to serve as a priest again, but in 1978, at the age of 69, due to his very poor health, he retired. And he spent the next 5 years largely in a hospital bed. Not only did he prophesy his own death, which he did. He prophesied many things about his own death, exactly when it would happen. But very interestingly, he asked that if his wife were to die 15 years later, that she be buried next to him. It's kind of an odd request, but it was prophetic. He knew that in 15 years his wife would die, and he knew that in requesting that she be buried next to him, they would uncover his tomb. And this is what happened. So Father Ilie reposed on July 22nd, 1983. And sure enough, 15 years later, his wife reposed. So when they opened the family crypt to bury her next to him, they discovered that Father Ilie's body was incorrupt and very fragrant. His own grandson attests to the fact that it was especially his right hand, very important as a priest. The right hand is the one that blesses over the gifts, makes them into the body and blood of Christ, the right hand that people kiss. His right hand, his grandson attested, was especially fragrant and smelled like a strong fragrance of myrrh, constantly exuding off of it. And he's quoted as saying that he was not the sole witness of this, but many others could attest to it. However, this was still very early. 15 years after his repose, you don't officially glorify someone or even uncover their relics typically that early. And so this was kept rather secret, and his relics were covered again. But years later, his incorrupt relics were exhumed when one of his daughters petitioned the patriarch to exhume them again. And so they exhumed his body. They found the relics still yet incorrupt. And then the patriarch or a bishop, I forget which, came and read a prayer over the body. And this is what they do. When they find incorrupt relics, they don't assume that it's a godly miracle. There's a lot of reasons that bodies can be incorrupt. And most of those reasons are not good ones. And so one of the things that they'll do is a bishop will read a prayer over the incorrupt relics and beg God that if this supposed miracle is because the person was somehow under the ban of a priest, he had committed some grave sin, that the body would then decompose. The prayer was read and nothing happened, but they continued to be fragrant, and so they recognized this was a sign of incredible holiness. And so they took his relics, even though he's not officially glorified yet. His whole body was taken out, and it was placed in a glass case, a glass coffin, and it's to this day on display in Bucharest, where many people go and ask his prayers, and many miracles occur. So I told you that there is a story from Father Jestin Parvu that I wanted to share with you that will tell you about his holiness during his life. So in that second imprisonment, this is probably the most famous story about Father Ilie. Father Jestin Parvu, who was the abbot from Periprava monastery, remembered this, saying, "I stayed for 4 years with Father Ilie Lacatusu at the extermination camp of Periprava in the Danube Delta. His behavior was remarkable generally, through his strong interiorization and quietness. Rarely could you hear him say anything. But when he did, it was mainly for urging us to pray when there was danger. I can say about this man that he had the great gift of meekness. He was always trying not to stand out, but to turn himself into an insignificant person among others. I remember a wondrous event when Father Ilie played a very important role in our lives. On the 30th of January, in that working colony, we were all sent directly into the channel to cut the reeds. Can you imagine what this meant? In the freezing temperatures during winter, death. This was a death sentence to be sent into the waters. We were all frightened, especially that we noticed militiamen ready to use their machine guns in case they tried to escape the waters. Probably they were waiting to execute us, believing that we might refuse the order. There was an area of about 40 hectares of water, and the reeds were just at the bottom that they wanted us to collect. We all started to murmur and had no thought to get into the water whatsoever. The militiamen told us to get in the water and collect 2 sheaves or bundles of reeds each. But how could we do this? We hesitated. But then Father Ilie had a very firm word and encouraged us all. He said, "We get in because these ones have a bad thought. They will shoot us. Let us then get into the water, because the Mother of the God and the Holy 3 Hierarchs, who are commemorated on January 30th, will take us out unharmed." Well, so we entered. We entered the water up to our chins. We cut and collected the reeds. We put them into bundles. We stayed in the water for about 3 hours. And then we had to arrange the 2 bundles, which were cleaned, measured, and fixed according to size. And the temperature was minus 30 degrees Celsius, with a thick ice layer of 20 to 30 centimeters, so that you could see through the yellow lilies blossomed under the water. And at all this time, there were birds in the sky as if looking at us. But at the end of this ordeal, we were all unharmed and wet. Water was pouring from us. A great miracle this was. In the morning, when we started, there was such a fog, very cloudy and very cold. But at once the sun popped up in the sky, and there was such light, and suddenly such heat everywhere that the militia themselves started to run away at the miracle. But they came back. After that day of work, we took off our clothes, which turned dry as if we had placed them in the hottest oven, with such steam pouring off of them. We took our shoes, got dressed, and went back to the colony. And so indeed, the Mother of God and the 3 hierarchs were with us all and helped us on the 30th of January, and no one got sick. All due to the prayers of Father Ilie, because otherwise we surely would have been dead. This is Father Ilie, an incredible figure. This is Father Ilie with his wife and one of his children when he was in his younger years. This is Father Ilie in his later years. One of the most common pictures of him. I love this picture. I have this one in my office. And because of his holiness and the miracles that continue to occur at his relics, they're already making icons of him. Here's one of the icons of Father Ilie. A really beautiful icon. Here you see his hands. These are the fragrant hands of Father Ilie. And here, with his mustache still intact, is the face of Father Ilie, which is on display in Bucharest to this day. So in my office, if you come in for confession or whatever, when you face that wall, on the top left, you'll see this icon of Father Ilie. I was so inspired by his life and his witness. So that is of the talks that I've given so far, probably of all of them, that's my very favorite. That's Father Ilie. And again, like you saw last week, Father Ilie, under his vestments, you'll notice prison garb, the striped prison guard worn underneath. Really beautiful. So that's Father Ilie. So next week we will talk about, is Andrew Stallman here? We'll talk about Andrew's favorite. Who's your favorite? Yeah, so Father Sofian Bogiu, who, well, I thought it was his favorite. I mean, there's a couple of videos of Father Sofian, which is on YouTube, that Andrew really loved. And so next week we'll talk about him, one of the great elders of the 20th century. So we have the prayers of Father Ilie, and again, may the Lord strengthen you in this third week of Great and Holy Lent. Amen.